look, I'll start off with the main question, which I think is on everyone's mind, and I'll start off with how aggressive do you think the tax office is currently? We all know that during COVID they were quite light on their recovery process. So, on their lightest period, on a 1 to 10, where do you think they're sitting at the moment?
About 10.
10, okay.
Yep. So I think they're worse from an aggressive point of view than they were pre-COVID.
Okay.
So there's a couple of factors for that. One is that they weren't recovering. The other is, I don't know whether it actually helped businesses to say you don't have to pay your tax for 2 years. So the debts are so much higher, they've been there for so much longer. And the way that the ATO are now classifying COVID debt is that they're looking at that debt, and if you say, okay, where's the debt at? How's it classified? They're saying it's a 3-year-old debt, even though they told you to not pay it for 2 years. So a 3-year-old debt is much worse and much harder to negotiate than a most recent debt. We're seeing lots of sort of flags on files. Even though during COVID they said we're here to help, the hidden message was you still have to proactively contact us. So for the businesses that didn't proactively contact the ATO during the COVID period, yes, no one knocked on their door. Yes, there were no scary letters. However, it shows a 2-year period of non-engagement and non-compliance.
That's interesting. Look, I was going to probably say maybe a 6 out of 10. So yeah. I think there's probably a lot of room for the tax office to be a lot more aggressive. And I'm going off the wind-up notices. I think there's quite a lot more they could do.
Yep.
So, but they gradually getting to that point. And obviously DPNs, we all know there was about, I can't remember the number, about 22,000 last year issued.
Yeah, so I think we're up to about 56,000.
56,000, yep.
And I suppose that's another reason I would say for the aggression. So pre-COVID, to issue a DPN, a case officer had to look at the file, a case officer had to review what was going on, whereas there's been what we call, I don't know if the ATO call it, if the ATO are watching, a one-touch campaign. So a computer will ring a client or a debtor. Sometimes in a tradie situation, it might be the wife. A private number comes up, you don't answer it, that's your one touch. The automatic next step was a DPN.
Right.
There was not a review of a file. So if the accountant, and I don't know whether there's any accountants in the room that experience this, if the accountant had been talking to the ATO, or if you had been doing voluntary payments, which pre-COVID would stop enforcement action, that was not enough and is not enough at the moment to stop a computer issuing a DPN.
Right. Now, with DPNs, so I'm going to be quite bold in this statement, but are DPNs really tools that the ATO are using? Has anyone in the room ever seen a director bankrupted through a DPN? Okay, we've got one. Okay, and that's quite rare, I think, because I've seen a lot of DPNs, but the tax office rarely follows through and they get negotiated. So I haven't seen many, but you've seen a bankruptcy for a DPN? Yeah. So, if we think about 56,000 DPNs issued, you would think there'd be a lot of bankruptcies, but I am not seeing that. So do you think the ATO is issuing that DPN and they're getting a result out of the response and that's it for them?
Yeah, I think so. It's also making people personally liable. So then when there are events of insolvency down the track, I think we will see them relying upon the lockdown period or relying upon, okay, well, you're now personally liable for this portion. So even if you, and obviously you can talk to this better than I can, but even if you liquidate the company, you're going to get rid of this much, but there's still this huge pile here that now needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. And look, I've had a few voluntary administrations into a debtor company arrangement where there was a major issue was a tax debt and there was a DPN attached to it. And part of a proposal that the director offered to the tax office was, I'm sourcing funding to pay off the tax debt. It's not the full debt. However, I need you to relieve me of my director penalty notice. And that worked in some cases. In some cases, it doesn't. The ATO does take a commercial approach to these things, I think.
At the stage that we're at?
No, they won't. Yeah.
So the way the ATO works is they're different to any other commercial beast or any other commercial negotiation you've ever had. So in the liquidation, it's a very different negotiation because you're dealing with a different team, a different department. When we're dealing with them, their KPIs are not collection. The KPI is compliance. So they're not driven by collection. So even if you say you can accept this $100 or you get nothing, they don't care. You are dealing with a bureaucrat. Their KPIs and their markers are we need to deal with this matter within 28 days. Within 28 days, it has to get off my desk. Now that might be compliance, and compliance is not payment in full. Compliance can be an active agreed payment arrangement, or it goes legal. Now, it doesn't really matter whether there's collection. So if you ring them up and say, okay, we owe you $200, take $100, or you're going to get nothing because we're going to go insolvent, they go, okay. So we've had huge arguments with directors of debt in regards to companies that might have 200-300 employees, saying that if you sink this company right now, no one is going to get their super, no one is going to get paid, and all these business people are going to lose their jobs. Now, there's about 2 directors of debt in Brisbane that will consider that. Any other level, any other lower level won't even take that on board. So when you get dealing with them, it's not like a commercial negotiation. It is really looking at there's legal practice requirements that they're allowed to take into consideration, and they will just look at what they're allowed to, and it's extremely subjective on who you're dealing with and how applications are prepared.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference between, a lot of people ask, how do you work with accountants and how do you work with liquidators? I mean, for us, we negotiate with the tax office, but we can actually force the issue by way of voting. So, deed of company arrangement, tax office is one voice, one vote, and the company may have 200 employees. So we have a lot more power if they can't agree. But I can see your point that, they don't look at it commercially, for them it's just compliance.
And they have the power in a way when we're involved, because if we don't reach an agreement, the next step is a wind-up.
A wind-up,
or a statutory demand.
Yeah, and you mentioned KPIs. Now, I'm trying to wonder how the ATO chooses. They must have a massive amount of debtors right now. The economy's at its worst state for quite a long time. COVID's damaged a lot of businesses. There's I think $75 billion worth of debt with the SME market. So how does a tax office, do they have a KPI? You say they don't have a KPI on collections. It's quite surprising. If I was running a business, that would be my main KPI. So are they choosing?
So it's about compliance. So when you hear them talk about what's the total amount of collectible debt, that's the debt that's not in arrangements.
Yep. Okay. So they actually don't report. So if they actually reported debt under an arrangement, that could be ballooned.
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay, that's quite
because they're
interesting.
talking about compliance and non-compliance.
Right.
Yeah.
So if your debt is under arrangement, that's
I don't believe that's in their
That's quite
figures.
interesting. So the debt might be quite. Gee, I'd say Australia's insolvent by that. That's quite interesting.
But how they choose.
Yeah, how do they choose? Do they go, look, that's a low-hanging fruit client, so we're going to attack them first because we'll get a quick recovery? Or do they just, how do they choose?
So I think the point of the DPNs was to rattle the tree and get low-hanging fruit across the board. Yep. I think it's a cheap tool. You don't need to engage lawyers, you don't need panel lawyers, you don't need to draft proceedings, you don't need to do anything. The computers are issuing these, and the amount, I don't know whether there's anyone that's looked at recent DPNs issued by the ATO, but the amount of errors and technical errors and the raft of issues in those DPNs is huge. But it's an easy, like you said, a scare tactic. I don't think there is any other way that I could say that there's one industry or one amount of debt that's being focused on more than another amount of debt. Developers have huge red flags. If there's unpaid GST in relation to developers, they're a target. If you're in what's called significant debt management, which is over sort of 5 or 6 million, target private wealth, individuals with huge debt, another target, labour hire is another target at the moment. But otherwise, we've got clients that have come to us that have got a $200,000 debt that have had summonses issued, and we've got other clients that have got a $5.5 million debt that haven't even got DPNs.
Yeah. And I see that also. I mean, it's quite annoying seeing different clients getting treated differently. I've seen the same. I've seen clients that enter into a 4-year repayment plan for $16 million debt, and I see clients for $500,000 that can't get more than 12 months, which is quite annoying seeing.
And so I think the only way you can guarantee to a client that they're protected from further action is a compliant arrangement.
Yeah.
Voluntary payments won't do it. By saying, oh, they're under $1 million, that won't guarantee it. You have to be in a compliant arrangement.
And when you say compliant arrangement, what does that mean?
So that means an arrangement that the ATO have agreed to. And an arrangement will only stay compliant if you both pay the monthly amounts that are due, but you also lodge everything that's due on time and that you pay everything that's due on time.
Right.
So if you're a large withholder and you're not lodging and paying on time and you've delayed or defaulted for 2 months, you are no longer in a compliant arrangement.
Right. And do you see a difference in the types of tax? So, is income tax treated differently to, say, GST and PAYG, or they treat all tax the same?
Except super. They're very cranky about super. So unpaid super and the penalties that are applied to unpaid super is a completely different category. And if there is a lot of unpaid super and you're also trying to negotiate on income tax debt, the super will also outweigh and they will want that paid quicker. And that will be a factor in an arrangement and what you can obtain for the client compared to if there's no super debt.
Yeah, okay, it's interesting. I was going to say, I was going to ask you, and I'll start with mine, the best ever payment plan or arrangement I ever negotiated with a tax office, which would have been a few years ago. I actually negotiated the super. So I was actually able to negotiate for the tax office to take 3 cents in the dollar for the super outstanding. Now, they didn't agree to it, but I had the votes. So it got pushed through and they didn't say anything. So what was your best?
Wow. So we can't get rid of core debt without an event of insolvency. But what we can do is get rid of interest and penalties. So I think the ATO's interest rate at the moment sits at around 10.5% compounded daily. So the interest and penalties add up very quickly. So my best reduction would have been about $1 million in interest and penalties for a debt that had sat there for 20 years.
Okay. And,
but no cents in the dollar. So we can't, other than an event of insolvency, you can't get rid of core debt.
And that's it. There's a policy behind that. And someone explained it to me. The reason is a tax office can't be seen to let primary principal tax to be reduced because that gives an example to the whole industry. So they need to be seen as not doing it unless there's a solid practitioner like me negotiating hard with.
And people think that there's an automatic right that if you're a good person, that you'll just get your interest and penalties back. But that's not the case. And people also think there's an automatic right. Well, if I owe $200 in core debt and $50, I like small numbers, and $50 is the interest and penalties, well, I'll just ring them and I'll say, if I give you my $200, can you write off the $50? That doesn't happen either. So there are specific requirements, and again, it's very bureaucratic, but an application needs to be made that ticks all their little boxes, a bit like a choose your own adventure, to get rid of that $50. It's not an automatic given right. People used to think, I don't know whether people still do think, that the ATO is a cheap small business bank. I don't agree with that. I don't know if there's any lenders here, but when you look at what a lender's interest rate are, even at the moment, and compared to then if you want to borrow or refinance or what you want to do, or if things don't quite go to plan, you are not guaranteed to get that interest and penalties back.
Interesting. Now, with the tax office, they're regarded as a model litigant. Do you think in their negotiations they practice as a model litigant?
So I stay away from the litigation side of things now. But it is difficult to conduct a commercial negotiation when it's getting to the crux of it, that we need to save this company, we need to give them time, this is what they need. I don't know whether at that point you are having the same discussions that you would otherwise have if proceedings were issued about what a model litigant would or wouldn't do.
Yeah. And most of the experiences I have been positive, but I have seen sometimes they sort of steer away from that model litigant scenario. Sometimes the case officers cranky at the clients. They've been promised the world and they don't like, promises not being delivered.
That's that's huge. And so often if we come in and there's been 2 years of promises, it helps because the debt officers know us.
Yep.
And so when we're engaged, we can say, look, they're actually wanting to change. Yep. They're wanting to do something. But if we put something up and the client does not comply with it, that puts you back 100 steps.
Yeah. Now, I understand why, there's accountants and lawyers here. Why can't accountants and lawyers, they can, but what's the difference between yourself doing the negotiations versus the accountant or the lawyer for the firm, for the client, sorry?
So I think the easiest way that I describe it is if you have smashed your knee, you go to the GP and you say, Mr. GP, Mrs. GP, I have a smashed knee. Your general GP can't fix your smashed knee. So they send you off to a specialist who only looks after smashed knees, nothing else. Makes your smashed knee beautiful so you can run a marathon again. And then you love your GP forever. So I'm like the smashed knee specialist. Right. This is all we do, all day, every day, absolutely nothing else. So if the ATO change their policies, which at the moment they're changing weekly, we know the debt officers, we know the policies, we know what they want to see in the applications, we know what works, we have the relationships. Like our guys know when the senior debt officers are on holidays, yep. where they've gone, when they've had babies. Yes, okay, it's meant to be an impartial process, but we're all human. Yeah. If you have that relationship and we know what they need to see and we know what they can accept, and often the applications will be written for a bureaucrat to read. Like I said, it's a choose your own adventure. And I don't think accountants and lawyers, if it's not your specialty, I don't lodge my own BAS. I don't even know how to lodge BAS. That's not my thing. So I think there's a real place in this world for all of us to be specialists in our field and be brilliant at what we do. And I don't think it's possible for us to all be brilliant at all things.
Yeah. And have you ever had a scenario where the accountant's tried and, the client says, look, I'm not happy, and then you've reapplied? Is that possible? Yeah, so
we get that lots.
Okay.
Yeah, so we get it both from accountants and clients, that the accountant's tried, they've been knocked back. Sometimes the accountant will have a beautiful presentation with bar graphs and pie charts and it's all very pretty, but it doesn't meet the legal practice requirements of what the ATO want to see. It makes our job a bit harder because you've got a formal refusal. And some accountants say to me, oh, well, you just keep ringing until someone says yes. But what happens is that puts flags on the file. So every time you're ringing a case officer, they're logging notes and they're writing a formal refusal. So you could have 4 formal refusals, which make it much harder. Yeah. It's still possible. We get that a lot.
Yeah. So look, what I was going to mention, and we're probably very busy with financiers at the moment, so we're getting quite a lot of our work from financiers, quite a lot of receiverships, and what that is causing is a lot of grief for the tax office because we obviously jump ahead of a tax office. So I think a lot of businesses are going to have very limited cash for negotiations. We get engaged also to review payment plans on behalf of financiers. So financiers know there's a big debt clocked on the portal. They approach us saying, do you think this is doable? And we review the payment plan and say, yeah, the cash flow can allow it or it doesn't allow it. But surely the ATO must be concerned in, obviously, economy tightening up, inflation, high interest rates, wage growth isn't happening. There's less cash out there to pay them. So do you think the ATO is understanding of this concept?
So I don't think they're understanding of it. I think they're very aware of it though. So especially with big debt. So we're dealing with a lot of debt. We're dealing with small debt, but we're dealing with more debt over $1 million than I've ever dealt with. $1 million used to be a massive matter. $1 million is about an average matter at the moment. And when you sort of hit that marker, one of the things that the ATO are obsessed with in an application is the ongoing viability of a business. And so then they're looking at all those things that you've just mentioned about how can the business survive. So yes, you might be able to meet this payment plan, or yes, you might be able to do this month, but what is the plan for the ongoing viability? And if the ongoing viability can't be demonstrated, they won't approve a plan.
Yeah. We had one matter where we were trying to explain to the tax office the cash flow of a fruit picker company and explain to them the seasons. And they weren't understanding whatsoever. So we were trying to say, look, they'll pay you a bit per month, but at the end of the season, you'll get a lump sum, and they just weren't understanding it. Do you get a lot of that, uncommercial people?
So you have to also remember that a lot of the people you're dealing with at the ATO don't have the education that we do. They don't have the backgrounds that we do. Many are not tertiary. They're not educated the way we are. They're quite bureaucratic. Like you look at some of the maybe my phone gives me the algorithms, but you look at the grad ads that pop up. Like they pop up everywhere. They pop up on Facebook and LinkedIn of who the grads are coming into the ATO. So I think we sometimes go in assuming that you're negotiating with a peer potentially like someone here.
So you get the stats, you actually get these stats when they go into they work for the ATO.
Well, you know how your phone knows what you do. So, like, if it's a grad program, I get ads on my phone.
Oh, okay.
Do you want a job at the ATO?
I know the people we should be taking out to lunch, and wine and dine.
No, not those stats. But because we know a lot of the people now, they sort of will say. The other thing that's happened with the ATO that's made it very difficult is a lot of their senior people have left. So the same with any organisation. So if you've had people there for years and years, you have knowledge that you can't write in a handover document. It's not necessarily policy. There are people that have been there in significant debt that were the debt managers and debt case officers with 20 years experience. Now, a lot of them have left, so they had a lot more discretion and more sensibility and understood. They would understand your fruit pickers, right?
Yeah.
So if we had a matter like that, there's 3 directors that we could escalate it to that you can have a very sensible conversation to. But there's probably only a very small amount that you could have that conversation with. And when you're losing that senior understanding and discretion, you have problems.
Yeah. Well, it's important to know who to talk to, especially such a bureaucratic organisation like the tax office.
Yeah, and so people say to me, well, why don't you just talk to them about everything? But we can't abuse that relationship, and there are processes, and we get very good results with the normal case officers. But your fruit picking would be a perfect example where we would escalate it to the directors.
To the right person.
Yeah.
Now, Tommy, I haven't seen it. I've seen it once, but they talk about the ATO accepting security for payment arrangements.
Yep.
Have you ever dealt with that?
Yep. So there's an entire securities team.
Yep.
So they're in Parramatta in Sydney. And so there are certain times where they will accept security. It can be done if you need an out-of-the-box arrangement or if it's a significant debt. Clients hate it, advisors hate it. It's sort of a last port of call rather than a first because you're giving security over a house. But we've done it. Again, there's a specific director that we deal with in the securities team when we need to do those.
And are the banks involved? How do they feel when they get the phone call saying, "Can you please consent to the ATO taking security over the property"? Do they panic? Do they hit the panic button?
The banks?
The banks, financiers?
We're not involved in that bit. There's usually lawyers and accountants. So I suppose that's important to note too. We often work in parallel. So with a number of different, whether it's a broker or a financier or even liquidators. So often if a company goes into liquidation, you'll be doing your thing and we'll assist the director if they don't want to go bankrupt with their personal liability, or if an accountant's working on getting lodgements up to date or giving advice, the accountant will work in their row, we'll work in ours, and then there might be a financier in a third column, and we all get to the bottom of where a client might need to be. So we are extremely limited in what we do, and we work in conjunction with a lot of specialists.
Yeah, so in that, look, we had a lunch in Brisbane a few months ago, and we actually spoke about a case study where everyone in this room, or industries in this room, would actually work together, and so the accountant referred us the job. We did a voluntary administration to a deed of company arrangement. We needed funding for the deed of company arrangement. So we had the accountant, we had the funder, we had the lawyer that structured it all in a document, but then the director had quite a significant personal tax debt that he had to go negotiate with the tax office, where you came into play. So we can all work together because we all have specialties in that area.
And it got the client every bit. And that client was over the moon. They could not believe that so many people had truly tried to help them and that they would not have found all these people if it wasn't for all of our relationship.
And knowing the right people, I don't think that client would have got that result if he if he didn't get the right advice. So having the right people for the right jobs or tasks in a restructure is so valuable, and we saw that in that study, case study.
And he wasn't a sophisticated client.
No.
And he had taken over his dad's business with a huge debt. But he was trying to look after his dad, and he was trying to look after his staff, and he was trying to manage it all, and he was beyond grateful for everyone helping him.
Yeah. David, yes.
All right. Olga, obviously just gone through the perfect storm with COVID. How the ATO actually coping? Like, I mean, presumably it's a whole new playbook or whatever. And you mentioned that sort of senior people have left. Is that a whole effect of what's going on and how they're coping?
I think a lot of senior people left in a lot of industries. They sort of were almost getting to retirement, or they quite enjoyed their job, and then COVID hit and they're like, I'm out. So I think that's why, part of the reason why a lot of people did leave at that point. I think it's difficult with new blood and a lot of junior blood, but I know that they've been given very specific directions about collecting, and that it's game on, so to speak, that, we've had our pause and we need compliance now.
Do you find that there's any differential between industries' payment plans, for example, if you're getting a longer or shorter time period for plans, like for example services or retail?
Yeah, so the ATO are very mindful, like I said, about viability. So we're finding if it's a client that's within the construction industry or the building industry and they've got huge debt, they're very concerned about the ongoing viability. So they're concerned about, they wouldn't do, say, a balloon payment for a company in the construction industry. Labour hire as well, they really don't like, and unpaid GST. Those are the three main ones. But yeah, the viability in the construction industry is their biggest concern when you're looking at arrangements.
The Labour hire's a bit touchy.
Just a bit.
What's the longest plan you've put in place?
During COVID, we've got some 5 years, some long ones. But the message I was screaming, but no one was listening, from the rooftops during COVID was, talk to us now. We can get you the most insane plan you can ever get. We can get rid of the most insane amounts of interest and penalties. Everyone's like, oh no, I don't want to deal with it now. But it's not quite there now.
Just a quick one. If the worst comes to fruition in terms of we get another interest rate rise next Tuesday and more, and we fall into a recession that most economists are predicting, how likely would they reverse back to being like they were back in COVID days?
I think it's unlikely. I don't believe, I was litigating during the GFC, but I don't believe during the GFC they did the same. They were softer, but they were nowhere near as lenient, and didn't have such long pauses during COVID. But I couldn't imagine having a recession so close to COVID with the debt having accumulated so high that they would be as lenient.
And we've had a change of government also. Do you think the change of government's changed anything? Or do you think...
I don't think so, not from what we've seen.
Yeah.
You said that the ATO were taking security over property. Are they taking unregistered mortgages? Or
So they don't take... It can be a tool to be offered in a negotiation to get an arrangement that they might not otherwise accept.
Have you seen them take an unregistered mortgage?
No.
Okay.
But that's a very specific way of doing a negotiation to secure a payment plan or a payment arrangement that they wouldn't otherwise agree to. And they would probably only be used in really exceptional circumstances. Sometimes you might have a household name client with a very significant debt, but the director wants to sell a property. And that's always been on the cards that they want to sell the property. The sale of the property will pay off a significant amount of the debt. They're pretty much at the end of the road. Securities are only used when it's sort of that or liquidation. Like I said, they're household names they don't want to liquidate. They do have a viable business, but we need something to negotiate to secure it to get them over the line. And so that's when that's used, and often that sale's coming up.
Yeah.
After you negotiate that 3 cents in the dollar, how many times do you get audited?
Oh, well, it wasn't me, it was a client, and yeah, he was on their audit list, their heavy audit list, yeah. They weren't too happy. There was talk, they did mention they were going to go to court and overturn it, but they just couldn't do it because it was a better return than a liquidation. And that's the rule of thumb for going to court and overturning a DOCA. They wouldn't be able to prove that. So, yeah, it wasn't the greatest. I just couldn't fault it. It was a better return. It got pushed regardless of my vote. The tax office did mention, oh, this is just ridiculous, but I think their advice was, well, you can't do anything about it. So, but yeah, that would have been, that's what happens. Once a company goes into a voluntary administration and a deed of company arrangement, after that DOC is signed, they are on the priority compliance list. If they miss a beat on compliance, they get the process straight away.
And it's similar in a way, like I was saying, with payment arrangements. So if you miss an ongoing liability, that arrangement will default. You might not get a letter telling you it's defaulted, or you might think that you've made it up. But even if you make up that payment after that default has occurred, you're no longer in a compliant position.
Yep.
Sorry, I'll ask a question. So if the payment arrangement's totally complied with, but the rest of the creditors are left unpaid for a few months, is that a breach from your end?
So we don't deal with
From
it.
the tax, that's only for the tax.
Yep,
so
only
it's
tax.
fully compliant.
Yep, fully
only on the
compliant
basis of payments.
because it's compliant in the eyes of the ATO. The ATO don't really care about anyone else.
Well, I'm just saying
They-
ongoing
they
viability.
really care about themselves.
But the ongoing viability in the whole process. of
Well, if
vetting
you
that,
have a compliant arrangement, they would never have need to look at the ongoing viability of the business. So the only reason they're looking at the ongoing viability of the business and other creditors is if you're not in a compliant position. So if you maintain that compliant position with the ATO, they never have need to ask you about any of that.
that's the segue into administration, simply to deal with the rest of the creditors.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Another question, yeah?
Sorry, can I ask another question?
Pretty safe. I
We like questions, Kate. It means they're listening.
Client, say $1 million debt. Can you give us an average of upfront payment versus payment plan length?
We very rarely ever do an upfront payment.
Right.
The only time we would ever consider an upfront payment, very, very rarely. Upfront payments would be if we're, again, like security, we're at the end of the road, you've had non-compliance or you've had defaulted plans or you've had promised plans that haven't been paid. So we've been recently negotiating on one that was $8.5 million, and we had 2 payment plans agreed to that and all the interest remitted. So we had about $750,000 remitted, 2 payment plans agreed to with no upfronts, but then the client didn't bloody lodge their ongoing, they're a large withholder. So they went 3 months without reporting, lodging or paying. So the payment plans were no longer viable and the ATO said, we don't believe you anymore. But otherwise, no, we would never ever offer an upfront payment. I think we're going to see a bit of a shift in that. I think the more non-compliant a business has been and the bigger the debt is, we might need to do more of them. But if any of you picked up the phone and said, hey, debt line, I want to negotiate a payment plan, they would tell you they want 20 to 40% upfront and 6 months as a general rule. But no, we don't do that.
Yeah.
Thanks,
If you
guys.
want.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.